Life quietly teaches a lesson that many don't recognize until years have already passed. The harder you try to arrange the world exactly as you want it, the more fragile your peace becomes. A delayed message unsettles you. One unexpected setback changes your entire mood. Someone else's opinion lingers in your mind long after the conversation has ended. Without noticing, your inner life begins rising and falling with circumstances you were never meant to control. It feels normal because nearly everyone lives this way. Still, beneath that constant tension lies another possibility, one that seems almost impossible at first, a mind that remains steady while life continues changing around it. History remembers emperors, philosophers, and leaders for what they accomplished, but the battles that shaped them were rarely fought in public. Long before Marcus Aurelius governed an empire, he was learning to govern something far more unpredictable than a nation, his own mind. He discovered that peace was never waiting at the end of perfect circumstances. It began the moment the struggle against reality started to loosen its grip. That insight became one of Stoicism's quietest revolutions. It did not promise an easier life. It revealed that much of our suffering grows from the unnoticed habits of thought we repeat until they begin to feel like truth. Think about how much of life is spent preparing for problems that never arrive, replaying moments that can never be changed, or chasing versions of happiness that always seem just beyond reach. The days pass. The mind grows tired. Still, the search continues, as though the next achievement, the next answer, or the next chapter will finally bring lasting contentment. Perhaps the search has been pointed in the wrong direction all along. The journey that changes a life does not begin by mastering the world around you. It begins by understanding the one place you carry into every success, every disappointment, every relationship, and every ordinary day, the landscape of your own mind. Every life begins with the quiet conviction that happiness is waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. It appears to exist in a better career, a larger home, a healthier body, a stronger relationship, or a future version of yourself that seems more disciplined, more confident, and somehow free from the uncertainty you carry today. The mind naturally reaches toward these possibilities because it is built to notice what is missing before appreciating what is already present. That instinct once helped human beings survive, always searching for the next source of food, shelter, or safety. In modern life, however, the same instinct often keeps the mind permanently focused on what has not yet arrived. One achievement replaces another, one goal gives way to the next, and satisfaction becomes something postponed rather than experienced. Even moments of success are often interrupted by thoughts of what still remains unfinished. Instead of becoming places of rest, accomplishments quietly transform into new starting lines. The destination keeps moving, and without noticing it, life becomes an endless pursuit of a finish line that continually retreats into the distance. At first, this way of living seems completely reasonable. Ambition appears healthy. Improvement feels necessary. Looking ahead is often praised as wisdom rather than questioned as habit. Few people stop to consider the possibility that the search itself may be creating the very emptiness it hopes to eliminate. When peace depends upon conditions that have not yet appeared, the present moment begins to feel like little more than a waiting room. Today becomes valuable only because it might lead to tomorrow. Ordinary experiences lose their richness because attention has already wandered towards something else. Meals are eaten while thinking about work. Conversations unfold while the mind rehearses future responsibilities. Even moments designed for rest become opportunities to plan, calculate, compare, and prepare. Life continues happening, yet awareness rarely stays where life actually exists. It drifts into imagined futures, searching for certainty inside events that have not yet taken shape. The irony is difficult to notice because everyone around us often shares the same pattern. Constant striving begins to look normal, even admirable. while quiet contentment is mistaken for complacency. The Stoic philosophers observed this tendency long before modern distractions multiplied its influence. They understood that the mind possesses an extraordinary ability to leave the present without the body taking a single step. A person may sit peacefully in a quiet room while internally traveling through years of regret, fear, expectation, and fantasy within only a few moments. None of those places truly exist except inside thought, yet they shape emotions as powerfully as physical reality. Anxiety often grows from conversations that have not happened. Disappointment appears before circumstances unfold. Joy is postponed because it has been assigned to conditions that remain uncertain. The result is a strange contradiction. While searching for a better life, the one already unfolding receives remarkably little attention. This does not happen because people lack gratitude or intelligence. It happens because the mind becomes convinced that fulfillment always belongs somewhere else. Once that belief settles deeply enough, it quietly begins directing every decision without announcing its presence. Consider how often satisfaction is attached to phrases that begin with the word when work becomes easier, when finances improve, when the relationship feels perfect, when confidence finally arrives, when the body changes, when the right opportunity appears. Each sentence seems harmless on its own, yet together they create an invisible contract with the future. According to that contract, peace cannot exist until certain conditions have been fulfilled. Unfortunately, life rarely honors such agreements. New opportunities introduce new responsibilities. Success creates higher expectations. Solved problems are replaced by different ones. The horizon continues moving because life itself never becomes completely stable. Seasons change, people evolve, circumstances shift without asking permission. As Marcus Aurelius observed, very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. If inner peace depends entirely upon external stability, then peace remains vulnerable to forces beyond personal influence. That vulnerability often explains why people feel exhausted despite making genuine progress. They have improved their circumstances while leaving untouched the habit of believing happiness always belongs to the next chapter. A quieter path begins to emerge once this pattern is recognized. It does not require abandoning ambition or pretending that goals have no value. Growth remains meaningful. Improvement still matters. The difference lies in refusing to postpone your entire life until those achievements arrive. Progress becomes healthier when it grows from appreciation instead of deficiency. Effort becomes steadier when it is no longer driven by the fear of never being enough. The present moment transforms from an obstacle into the very place where character is shaped, decisions are made, and life quietly unfolds. Tomorrow has never been guaranteed, but today has already arrived, asking only for your attention rather than your perfection. Perhaps the search has never truly been about finding a different life waiting somewhere ahead. Perhaps it has always been about learning to meet the one already before you with greater clarity, steadiness, and understanding. Once that possibility begins to take root, the direction of the journey changes almost without effort. The eyes remain open toward the future, but the mind slowly learns to stop abandoning the only moment it has ever truly possessed. Once the search begins turning inward, a quieter discovery gradually comes into view. Circumstances certainly shape our lives, but they do not always determine the quality of our inner experience. Two people can stand in the same room, hear the same words, face the same setback, and leave carrying entirely different emotional worlds. One feels defeated, convinced the moment has exposed a permanent weakness. The other walks away thoughtful, recognizing an opportunity to become wiser than they were the day before. The event itself remains unchanged. The difference lies somewhere else, hidden beneath the surface where reactions are formed before they are fully understood. This unseen process unfolds so quickly that it often feels automatic. A comment is heard, a decision is made, an unexpected obstacle appears, and almost instantly the mind produces a story explaining what it all means. That story becomes more influential than the event itself. Long before reality has the chance to settle, interpretation quietly takes control, shaping emotions, expectations, and future choices without asking for permission. This happens so naturally that most people never question it. They assume their feelings arrive directly from the world around them, as though circumstances possess the power to create frustration, embarrassment, or peace entirely on their own. It is an understandable conclusion because the connection appears immediate. Someone criticizes your work and disappointment follows. Plans collapse and anxiety arrives. An opportunity disappears and discouragement seems unavoidable. Looking more closely reveals something that is both simple and profound. Between what happens and what is felt, there is a brief moment that usually escapes attention. It lasts only an instant, yet within that instant, the mind quietly decides what the experience represents. Is this failure or instruction? Rejection or redirection? Loss or preparation? The answers often appear so quickly that they seem inseparable from reality itself. In truth, they are judgments shaped by habits, memories, expectations, and beliefs that have been accumulating for years. Think about how often a single sentence spoken by another person continues echoing long after the conversation has ended. The words themselves lasted only seconds, yet the mind repeats them throughout the day, adding new interpretations each time they return. Perhaps they meant this. Perhaps they were disappointed. Perhaps they no longer respect me. Gradually, the original event becomes almost unrecognizable beneath layers of assumption. Hours later, emotions are no longer responding to what actually happened, but to the story that has been quietly rewritten over and over again. Many sleepless nights begin exactly this way. A small moment grows larger simply because thought continues feeding it attention. Left unexamined, even ordinary experiences can become sources of lasting distress, not because reality demanded it, but because interpretation slowly transformed them into something heavier than they ever needed to be. This hidden habit influences far more than moments of criticism or disappointment. It appears whenever expectations collide with reality. A delayed response becomes evidence that someone no longer cares. A mistake becomes proof that personal growth has stopped. An unexpected challenge begins to feel like confirmation that life is unfair. The mind often rushes toward conclusions because certainty feels more comfortable than uncertainty, even when those conclusions create unnecessary suffering. Remaining uncertain requires patience, while immediate judgment creates the illusion of understanding. Unfortunately, quick conclusions often carry hidden costs. They close possibilities before evidence has fully appeared. They encourage emotional reactions that become increasingly difficult to reverse. They quietly convince us that the world is against us when, in many cases, the greatest struggle is taking place entirely within our own interpretation of events. If these reflections are helping you see your own mind a little more clearly, consider subscribing. By subscribing, you're joining a community devoted to timeless philosophy, deeper reflection, and practical wisdom that can be returned to whenever life feels uncertain. There is always another conversation waiting here, another perspective to explore, and another opportunity to strengthen the mind, one thoughtful step at a time. Now, let's continue. This is where real freedom begins to reveal itself, although it rarely arrives with dramatic force. It starts with the simple willingness to pause before accepting every thought as truth. That pause may last only a few seconds, yet it changes everything. Instead of asking only what happened, the mind begins asking what it is adding to the experience. Is this conclusion supported by reality, or is it shaped by fear? Is disappointment coming from the event itself, or from expectations that were never guaranteed? These questions do not eliminate pain, nor do they encourage pretending that difficult experiences are pleasant. They simply create enough space for wisdom to enter before emotion takes complete control. Over time, this quiet discipline becomes less like a technique and more like a way of seeing. The remarkable thing is that nothing outside needs to change before this transformation begins. The same people remain in your life. The same responsibilities continue demanding attention. Success still arrives unpredictably, and setbacks remain part of the human experience. What changes is the relationship between the mind and those experiences. Reactions become less impulsive because they are no longer driven entirely by first impressions. Emotional storms lose some of their intensity because they are not constantly strengthened through unquestioned interpretation. Gradually, a steadier perspective emerges. Instead of feeling pushed in every direction by changing circumstances, you begin recognizing that the greatest influence over your inner world has never belonged entirely to those circumstances in the first place. It has always depended, at least in part, upon the meaning you chose to give them. Once that understanding settles deeply enough, the search for peace no longer begins by trying to rearrange the world. It begins by learning to observe the quiet judgments that shape your experience of it, one ordinary moment at a time. The deeper you look into your own reactions, the more another question quietly begins to emerge. If your judgments shape so much of your experience, where did those judgments come from in the first place? Few of them appeared overnight. They were gathered gradually, often without permission or awareness, until they became so familiar that they started feeling like permanent parts of your personality. Long before you learned to make conscious decisions, you were already absorbing ideas about success, failure, strength, weakness, acceptance, and worth. Parents passed along beliefs shaped by their own experiences. Teachers rewarded certain qualities while overlooking others. Friends introduced comparisons that slowly became habits. Society offered endless definitions of what a meaningful life should resemble. Piece by piece, these influences settled into the mind, rarely announcing themselves as borrowed opinions. Instead, they quietly became the lens through which reality would later be interpreted. This process happens so naturally that it is almost invisible. A child who receives praise only after achieving something impressive may grow into an adult who believes rest must always be earned. Someone repeatedly criticized for making mistakes may begin avoiding challenges, not because they lack ability, but because failure has become tied to personal value. Another person raised in an environment where emotional vulnerability was dismissed may eventually convince themselves that asking for help is weakness rather than wisdom. None of these conclusions arrive through careful reasoning. They grow from repetition. The mind hears the same message enough times that it eventually stops questioning it. Over the years, these ideas become less like opinions and more like unquestioned facts. Decisions are made according to them. Relationships are shaped by them. Entire futures begin unfolding around assumptions that were accepted before they were ever examined. Comparison quietly strengthens this process. From an early age, attention is directed toward what others possess, accomplish, or become. One person appears more successful, another seems more attractive. Someone else looks happier, wealthier, or more confident. Without realizing it, the mind begins measuring its own value against constantly changing standards that were created by people living entirely different lives. This habit often survives into adulthood, becoming so automatic that many no longer notice how deeply it influences everyday thinking. As Epictetus reminded us, wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. Satisfaction fades quickly because someone always appears further ahead. Gratitude struggles to grow because attention keeps drifting toward what remains absent. Even genuine accomplishments lose their meaning when they are viewed through the endless lens of comparison. The external world becomes a mirror that never reflects enough, leaving the mind permanently searching for proof that it is finally worthy. Recognizing these hidden influences is not an invitation to blame the past or reject everything that shaped you. No one begins life with complete independence of thought. Learning from others is part of being human. Families, cultures, and communities all pass along wisdom that deserves appreciation. The challenge is learning to distinguish inherited wisdom from inherited limitation. One strengthens character, the other quietly confines it. That distinction can only be discovered through honest observation. Instead of asking whether a belief feels familiar, it becomes more useful to ask whether it is true. Instead of assuming every long-held opinion deserves loyalty, the mind gradually learns to examine it with patience rather than blind acceptance. This quiet examination does not weaken identity, it refines it. Beliefs that survive careful reflection become stronger because they are chosen consciously instead of inherited automatically. As this habit develops, another change begins almost unnoticed. Reactions slow down because they are no longer driven entirely by assumptions formed years ago. Old patterns still appear, but they no longer possess unquestioned authority. A familiar fear arises, and instead of obeying it immediately, you observe it. An old comparison enters the mind, and instead of accepting its conclusion, you recognize its source. Expectations inherited from countless voices gradually lose some of their influence because a quieter voice has begun to emerge beneath them. That voice does not rush. It does not demand perfection or constant achievement. It simply asks whether the person making today's decisions is acting from clear understanding or from habits that have never been challenged. The more honestly that question is explored, the less life becomes a repetition of unconscious patterns, and the more it becomes a deliberate expression of wisdom that has been patiently discovered rather than passively inherited. This constant anticipation slowly changes the way people move through the world. Instead of responding to life as it unfolds, they begin responding to imagined reactions from others. Decisions become less about personal conviction and more about avoiding criticism. Words are carefully measured before they are spoken, not because honesty is lacking, but because acceptance has quietly become more valuable than authenticity. Small choices become surprisingly difficult. Clothing is selected with imagined opinions in mind. Goals are postponed because someone might misunderstand them. Opportunities are ignored because failure could become visible. Even moments of joy are sometimes interrupted by the question of how they will appear from someone else's perspective. The remarkable thing is that many of these imagined judges never actually say anything at all. They exist almost entirely inside thought, yet they quietly influence countless decisions without ever revealing whether the fears surrounding them were justified in the first place. Real confidence develops differently. It grows quietly through repeated choices that align with your own principles, even when no one notices them. It appears each time honesty is chosen despite convenience. It strengthens whenever patience replaces impulse or discipline overcomes comfort. These moments rarely attract applause because they often happen in complete privacy. No audience is present. No recognition follows. Yet these unseen decisions gradually shape character far more deeply than public approval ever could. Confidence begins feeling less like an emotion that arrives unexpectedly and more like trust that has been patiently earned through consistent action. You stop asking whether everyone agrees with your choices and begin asking whether those choices reflect the kind of person you genuinely wish to become. The answer does not always bring immediate comfort, but it creates something much more dependable than temporary praise. As this understanding deepens, another quiet freedom appears. Decisions become simpler because they are guided less by anticipated approval and more by thoughtful conviction. Conversations become more genuine because they are no longer carefully performed for acceptance. Relationships often grow healthier because honesty quietly replaces constant people-pleasing. Ironically, those who spend less energy chasing approval frequently earn greater respect, not because they seek admiration, but because authenticity possesses a quiet strength that performance can never imitate. People recognize steadiness even when they cannot fully explain it. They sense the difference between someone who acts from principle and someone who acts from fear of rejection. Over time, this steadiness becomes its own reward. Confidence no longer depends upon applause because it has found a deeper source. It lives inside the quiet knowledge that your actions reflect your values, whether they are praised, criticized, misunderstood, or ignored altogether. Other people's opinions continue changing just as they always have. Some will appreciate your choices, others will question them. Neither response needs to determine the condition of your inner life. A person who learns to measure themselves by the quality of their character instead of the volume of approval discovers something remarkably peaceful. They stop borrowing confidence from the outside world and begin practicing it from within, one thoughtful decision at a time, until it becomes less like something they feel and more like someone they have quietly become. Confidence is often misunderstood because people confuse it with the complete absence of doubt. They picture someone who never hesitates, never questions a decision, and never feels uncertainty before taking an important step. From a distance, that image appears convincing. It promises a kind of inner certainty that seems almost untouchable. Real life tells a different story. Even the wisest decisions are rarely made with perfect clarity. The future keeps part of itself hidden from everyone. No amount of intelligence can eliminate every unknown, and no amount of preparation can guarantee a particular outcome. The mind naturally resists this reality because certainty feels safe. It offers the comforting impression that everything can be predicted if only enough effort is invested beforehand. Unfortunately, life continues unfolding according to its own rhythm, caring very little about our desire for complete reassurance. Waiting until every uncertainty disappears often becomes another way of postponing the life we hope to live. Think about how many opportunities quietly disappear because the mind insists on guarantees that reality cannot provide. A conversation remains unfinished because the perfect words never arrive. A meaningful goal stays untouched because success cannot be promised. A difficult decision is delayed again and again while the mind searches for one final piece of certainty that always seems just beyond reach. Days become weeks, and weeks quietly become years. Nothing dramatic appears to happen. Life simply continues moving, while hesitation slowly becomes a habit. The greatest loss is not always the opportunity itself. Often it is the gradual belief that confidence must arrive before action instead of growing because of action. This belief traps people inside endless preparation. They continue studying, planning, analyzing, and imagining every possible outcome while experience patiently waits outside the door they refuse to open. Fear plays an important role in this pattern because it often disguises itself as wisdom. It tells you to wait a little longer, gather more information, become slightly more prepared, or avoid unnecessary risk. Sometimes those suggestions are sensible. Careful thinking prevents careless mistakes. Patience often produces better decisions than impulsiveness. The difficulty begins when caution quietly transforms into avoidance. Fear becomes skilled at presenting itself as responsibility, while slowly convincing you to remain exactly where you are. The voice sounds reasonable because it rarely says never. It simply says not yet. Tomorrow appears safer than today. Next month seems wiser than this one. Another year promises greater confidence than the present moment. Gradually, life becomes filled with postponed beginnings, each one justified by the hope that certainty will eventually arrive before action becomes necessary. This is why resilience looks different from certainty. A resilient person does not wake each morning convinced that nothing difficult will happen. They simply trust their ability to respond when difficulty appears. That distinction changes everything. One mindset demands control over the future. The other develops confidence in the present. Instead of trying to eliminate uncertainty, attention shifts towards strengthening character. Patience becomes more valuable than prediction. Discipline matters more than perfect conditions. Calm observation begins replacing frantic attempts to foresee every possible outcome. The future remains unknown, but it no longer feels like an enemy waiting to destroy peace. It becomes an open landscape that can be entered without demanding complete visibility of every step ahead. Life quietly provides countless reminders that certainty has never truly existed. Careers change unexpectedly. Relationships evolve. Health shifts. Opportunities appear without warning, while carefully arranged plans sometimes disappear overnight. Trying to remove uncertainty from existence is like trying to stop the seasons from changing. The effort itself creates unnecessary exhaustion because it fights something woven into the structure of life. Acceptance does not mean becoming passive or careless. It means recognizing that uncertainty is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It is simply the environment in which every human life unfolds. Once this truth is accepted, enormous amounts of mental energy become available for something far more productive than constant prediction. Instead of asking whether the future can be controlled, attention naturally returns to what can actually be influenced. Choices made today, habits repeated consistently, the quality of your responses, the honesty behind your actions. These remain within reach regardless of tomorrow's uncertainty. Focusing on them creates a quiet stability because they belong to you rather than to changing circumstances. As Epictetus taught, make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. Confidence slowly stops depending upon favorable outcomes and begins depending upon the knowledge that whatever arrives will be met with patience, thoughtfulness, and discipline instead of panic. That shift cannot remove every fear, but it changes your relationship with fear itself. It becomes something observed rather than obeyed. Over time, uncertainty begins losing much of its power because it is no longer treated as proof that you are unprepared. It becomes a familiar companion walking beside every worthwhile pursuit. Some days it speaks loudly, other days it remains almost silent. Either way, it no longer decides the direction of your life. You continue moving, not because every answer has appeared, but because you have discovered something far more dependable than certainty. You have learned to trust the person making the decision rather than demanding guarantees from the path ahead. That quiet trust grows stronger each time you act according to your principles instead of your fears, until uncertainty itself becomes less like a barrier standing in your way and more like a permanent part of the journey that no longer has the authority to stop you. As uncertainty gradually becomes easier to tolerate, another habit quietly begins losing its influence. The constant need to control every possible outcome starts relaxing its grip. At first, the change is almost impossible to notice because the desire for certainty feels so reasonable. The mind naturally searches for predictable futures. It wants reassurance that effort will always be rewarded, that relationships will remain stable, that carefully made plans will unfold exactly as expected. There is comfort in believing tomorrow can be arranged before it arrives. There is safety in thinking enough preparation can remove every surprise. This instinct is deeply human. It seeks stability in a world that rarely promises it. The difficulty begins when this understandable desire slowly transforms into an expectation that life should obey our plans. Instead of appreciating moments of certainty when they appear, we begin demanding certainty as a condition for peace. That demand quietly places us in conflict with reality itself because reality has never agreed to such terms. Look closely at almost any source of prolonged stress, and somewhere beneath it, you will often discover an argument with uncertainty. The promotion has not been confirmed, so the mind invents dozens of possible outcomes. A relationship enters a difficult season, and thoughts rush ahead trying to predict where it will end. A medical appointment approaches, and the imagination fills empty space with frightening possibilities long before facts have appeared. In each situation, the future remains unwritten, yet the mind behaves as though uncertainty itself is an emergency that must be solved immediately. It searches relentlessly for answers that do not yet exist. It rehearses conversations, predicts disappointments, and constructs detailed scenarios that may never come to pass. Hours are spent attempting to control events that still belong entirely to tomorrow. By the time tomorrow finally arrives, much of the emotional energy has already been exhausted fighting possibilities instead of responding to reality. Despite this, the mind continues believing that one more plan, one more calculation, or one more attempt to anticipate every possibility will finally produce lasting security. There is nothing wrong with thoughtful preparation. Planning reflects responsibility. Careful consideration prevents unnecessary mistakes. The problem begins when preparation quietly crosses into obsession. Instead of helping you move forward, it begins keeping you in place. Instead of supporting wise decisions, it becomes an endless search for reassurance that can never fully satisfy. The line between preparation and control is subtle, yet the difference changes everything. Preparation accepts that uncertainty will remain after reasonable effort has been made. Control refuses to accept uncertainty at all. One encourages action despite incomplete knowledge. The other postpones action until complete certainty appears, even though complete certainty rarely exists. This endless struggle often creates more suffering than the uncertain event itself. Waiting for news becomes more exhausting than receiving it. Anticipating change feels heavier than adapting to change once it arrives. Much of the pain comes from resisting the simple fact that the future cannot be possessed before its time. The mind keeps reaching toward tomorrow, trying to force clarity from circumstances that have not yet unfolded. That effort rarely succeeds. Instead, it pulls attention away from the only place where meaningful choices can actually be made. The present moment quietly disappears beneath imagined futures, while today's opportunities are overlooked because tomorrow's possibilities seem more urgent. Life continues unfolding, but awareness remains somewhere else, trying to solve problems that reality has not yet presented. Acceptance changes this relationship in a surprisingly gentle way. It does not ask you to stop planning or stop caring about the future. It simply asks you to recognize the boundary between influence and control. You can prepare carefully without demanding guarantees. You can make thoughtful decisions without expecting perfect outcomes. You can work diligently while understanding that results will always involve factors beyond personal influence. This perspective removes an enormous burden because it allows effort to remain steady even when certainty is absent. Success no longer depends upon controlling every variable. It depends upon responding well to whatever eventually appears. That response remains entirely within your reach, regardless of how unpredictable circumstances become. Gradually, adaptability begins replacing rigid expectation. Instead of seeing unexpected change as proof that something has gone wrong, you begin recognizing it as part of the natural movement of life. Seasons never apologize for changing. Rivers do not resist their own current. Trees bend with strong winds because refusing to move would cause them to break. Nature quietly demonstrates that strength often appears through flexibility rather than resistance. Human beings sometimes forget this lesson. They mistake rigidity for discipline, believing firmness requires refusing to adjust. In truth, genuine steadiness often comes from knowing what should remain constant and what must be allowed to change. Principles remain rooted, responses remain flexible. Character stays steady while circumstances continue shifting around it. Over time, this understanding creates a deeper form of stability than certainty ever could. You stop measuring peace by how predictable life becomes and begin measuring it by how calmly you meet whatever life presents. Uncertainty loses much of its power because it is no longer interpreted as failure or danger. It becomes part of the landscape instead of an obstacle standing in your way. Plans still matter. Goals still deserve effort. Hope still has its place. But beneath all of them grows something quieter and far more dependable. You begin trusting your ability to adapt instead of demanding that the world remain unchanged. That trust cannot prevent unexpected endings, difficult seasons, or unforeseen challenges. It offers something more valuable. It allows you to remain steady while everything around you continues doing what it has always done, changing according to its own nature rather than according to your expectations. Adaptability naturally changes the way suffering is understood. As long as the mind believes life should unfold exactly according to its expectations, every unexpected event feels like evidence that something has gone wrong. A delayed opportunity becomes more than an inconvenience. It becomes a personal injustice. A difficult conversation becomes more than a painful memory. It becomes something that should never have happened. Loss becomes more than the absence of something valuable. It becomes an argument with reality itself. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Accept whatever comes to you woven in the pattern of your destiny, for what could more aptly fit your needs?" This quiet resistance often goes unnoticed because it hides beneath ordinary thoughts. The mind repeats the same sentences in different forms. This should not have happened. Things were supposed to be different. If only I had done something else. If only they had made another choice. These thoughts appear harmless at first, yet each repetition quietly pulls the past back into the present, allowing moments that have already ended to continue shaping the experience of today. Pain enters every human life without asking permission. No amount of wisdom, preparation, or discipline can completely prevent disappointment, illness, separation, failure, or grief. These experiences belong to the shared condition of being alive. Trying to build a life that excludes them entirely is like trying to create an ocean without waves. The effort itself becomes exhausting because it seeks something reality has never promised. While pain often arrives beyond personal control, suffering frequently grows through the way the mind continues relating to what has already occurred. A difficult event lasts for an afternoon, yet it is relived for years. A careless remark spoken in seconds quietly echoes through countless conversations with yourself. A single mistake becomes a permanent source of self-judgment because it is revisited over and over until it begins feeling larger than everything else that has ever happened. The original moment passes only once. The memory continues returning because attention repeatedly invites it back. This does not happen because people enjoy suffering. Quite the opposite. The mind returns to painful experiences because it believes constant examination might somehow change what has already been written. It searches for one forgotten detail that could undo the outcome. It imagines different endings, better decisions, wiser responses, hoping that enough reflection will eventually produce relief. Instead, the opposite often occurs. Each return strengthens emotional attachment to something that no longer exists outside memory. The event belongs entirely to the past, yet the emotional experience continues unfolding in the present because resistance quietly keeps it alive. Time itself cannot resolve this conflict if the mind refuses to release its argument with reality. Years may pass while the inner conversation remains exactly where it began. Notice how different the experience becomes when something painful is accepted rather than endlessly resisted. Acceptance is often misunderstood because it sounds passive to those who have never experienced it. Some believe acceptance means approving of injustice, pretending loss is pleasant, or refusing to improve difficult circumstances. It means none of these things. Acceptance simply recognizes the difference between acknowledging reality and fighting against the fact that reality already exists. A storm passes through a forest, whether the trees approve of it or not. Winter arrives without consulting anyone's preferences. Human life follows the same principle. Certain events occur regardless of personal wishes. Energy spent denying their existence cannot change them. It only delays the process of learning how to live wisely after they have happened. The mind often fears acceptance because it assumes letting go means forgetting. It worries that releasing anger somehow excuses what caused it. It imagines that ending internal resistance dishonors painful experiences or minimizes their significance. In truth, acceptance does not erase memory. It changes the relationship with memory. You stop carrying the past as though it remains unfinished. Instead of demanding a different yesterday, attention gradually returns to today's responsibilities, today's choices, and today's possibilities. The event remains part of your story, but it no longer becomes the author of every chapter that follows. This quiet shift rarely happens all at once. It develops through repeated moments of noticing when the mind has wandered back into old arguments and gently guiding it toward what can actually be influenced now. Some of life's deepest wounds cannot be healed by explanation alone. Certain losses remain painful because they mattered deeply. Love leaves behind grief when it disappears. Dreams leave disappointment when they fail. Trust leaves emptiness when it is broken. None of these emotions should be rushed away or treated as weaknesses. Feeling pain is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that something meaningful existed. The difficulty begins only when natural pain quietly transforms into permanent identity. A person stops saying, "I experienced loss," and begins believing, "Loss defines me." A painful chapter slowly expands until it seems to describe an entire life. Healing becomes difficult because the mind is no longer responding to an event. It is defending an identity built around that event. There comes a quiet moment when another possibility begins to appear. The experience cannot be changed, but the relationship with it can. Instead of asking why the event happened, attention gradually shifts toward how it will be carried from this point forward. That question contains far more freedom because it belongs to the present rather than the past. The answer will not always appear immediately. Some burdens require patience before they become lighter. Some grief softens so gradually that its healing is almost invisible while it is taking place. Yet each day spent refusing to argue with reality creates a little more space for peace to enter where conflict once lived. The mind slowly learns that acceptance is not surrendering to suffering. It is refusing to create additional suffering where none is necessary. As this understanding deepens, resilience begins taking on an entirely different meaning. It no longer depends upon avoiding pain or pretending difficult experiences never happened. Instead, it grows through the ability to carry pain without allowing it to become endless struggle. Life continues bringing unexpected challenges because that is part of its nature. Some days remain heavy, others arrive with surprising ease. Through all of it, one quiet realization becomes increasingly clear. The first act of healing is often much simpler than the mind expects. It begins the moment you stop demanding that yesterday become something other than what it already is, and gently return your attention to the only place where peace can still be built. The present moment waiting patiently before you. Once resistance begins to loosen its hold, something remarkably ordinary begins to reveal its true value. Attention slowly returns to a place that has been available all along, though it has often gone unnoticed. The present moment has never hidden itself. It has simply been overshadowed by the mind's habit of wandering elsewhere. One thought reaches back toward yesterday, searching for different endings to conversations that have already finished. Another races toward tomorrow, trying to solve problems that have not yet arrived. Somewhere in between, the quiet reality of this moment patiently waits, rarely demanding attention, never forcing itself into awareness. It asks for nothing dramatic, It simply offers the only place where life is actually unfolding. While the mind moves through memories and predictions, the present continues existing without complaint, carrying opportunities that often disappear before they are fully noticed. It is surprising how much of human exhaustion comes from living almost everywhere except where the body already is. A person may sit peacefully beside a window while internally arguing with events from years ago. Another walks through a beautiful morning without seeing it because tomorrow's responsibilities have already occupied every thought. The body remains here. The mind travels constantly. It revisits mistakes, imagines conversations, anticipates disappointment, compares one version of life against another, and quietly overlooks the only moment capable of receiving attention. This habit becomes so familiar that many assume it is simply the way thinking works. They rarely stop to consider that much of their tiredness comes not from physical effort, but from carrying yesterday and tomorrow at the same time. The weight feels normal because it has been carried for so long, yet it remains a burden all the same. The present often appears too ordinary to deserve appreciation. There are dishes waiting to be washed, messages still unanswered, errands unfinished, responsibilities that continue asking for attention. Nothing seems extraordinary. The mind therefore concludes that fulfillment must exist somewhere beyond this ordinary moment. It waits for a vacation, a promotion, a celebration, or some future event that promises deeper satisfaction. While waiting, countless quiet experiences pass almost unnoticed. Morning light enters the room. Fresh air fills the lungs. Someone offers a smile. A peaceful silence appears between two conversations. These moments ask for very little. They simply arrive and quietly leave again. Their value often becomes visible only in memory, long after they have disappeared. The tragedy is not that ordinary moments exist. The tragedy is how frequently they are sacrificed while searching for extraordinary ones. This does not mean every present moment feels pleasant. Some days arrive carrying grief, uncertainty, disappointment, or physical pain. Remaining present during difficult experiences is rarely comfortable. In fact, the mind often escapes into the future precisely because the present feels heavy. It promises relief by imagining a better tomorrow or distracts itself through endless reflection about the past. Yet neither direction changes what exists now. Escaping mentally may soften awareness for a short time, but reality patiently waits until attention returns. Learning to remain present does not eliminate discomfort. It changes the relationship with discomfort. Instead of immediately resisting difficult emotions or trying to outrun them through thought, you begin allowing them to exist without granting them complete authority over your awareness. They become experiences moving through the mind rather than permanent conditions defining your entire existence. This quiet practice slowly transforms ordinary decisions into something far more meaningful. Character is rarely built during dramatic moments alone. It develops through choices so small they often seem insignificant while they are happening. The decision to respond calmly instead of impulsively. The willingness to listen instead of immediately defending yourself. The discipline to complete simple responsibilities without waiting for perfect motivation. These moments rarely receive recognition from anyone else. They occur in kitchens, offices, quiet walks, ordinary conversations, and silent evenings when no audience is watching. Yet they quietly shape the direction of an entire life. Looking back years later, it is often difficult to identify one single decision that changed everything. More commonly, lasting transformation emerged through hundreds of unnoticed choices made faithfully in ordinary moments that seemed almost forgettable at the time. The mind often underestimates this because it prefers dramatic turning points. It imagines life changing through one remarkable breakthrough, one unforgettable conversation, or one extraordinary opportunity. Certainly, such moments sometimes appear. More often, however, change resembles the slow growth of a tree. Day after day, almost nothing seems different. Progress feels invisible. Then, after enough time has passed, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. As Aristotle observed, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act but a habit. Patience grows stronger through repeated practice. Calm responses become more natural because they have been chosen consistently. Discipline no longer feels forced because it has quietly become part of daily living. None of these qualities appear suddenly. They develop one present moment at a time, each decision gently reinforcing the next until a new way of living gradually replaces the old. Another quiet realization begins emerging through this process. The present moment is the only place where influence truly exists. Yesterday cannot receive another action. Tomorrow cannot yet receive one either. Plans for the future remain valuable, and lessons from the past deserve thoughtful reflection, but neither can be changed directly. Action belongs only to now. The next word you speak, the next thought you encourage, the next choice you make, all exist within this single unfolding moment. Recognizing this does not make the present feel smaller. It makes it immeasurably more important. Instead of becoming merely a bridge towards some imagined future, today becomes the place where every meaningful future is quietly created. As attention returns more faithfully to what is happening now, life begins feeling unexpectedly spacious. The constant pressure to solve every future problem starts easing because the mind realizes it can only respond to what actually exists before it. Regret loses some of its intensity because the past no longer demands endless revisiting. Even ordinary tasks begin carrying a different quality. Washing dishes becomes simply washing dishes instead of another opportunity to rehearse tomorrow's worries. Walking becomes walking instead of mentally reliving old disappointments. Listening becomes genuine listening instead of waiting for your turn to speak. These changes appear small, almost insignificant from the outside, yet together they reshape the experience of being alive. Peace slowly stops feeling like a distant destination waiting somewhere ahead. It becomes something quietly practiced within the ordinary rhythm of everyday life, one present moment after another, until the place that once seemed too simple to matter becomes the very foundation upon which a steady and meaningful life is built. Living fully in the present naturally uncovers another challenge that often remains hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. The moment external distractions begin to fade, the mind reveals just how uncomfortable it can be with simple stillness. A quiet room that should feel peaceful suddenly becomes crowded with unfinished thoughts. Memories that remained silent throughout a busy day quietly return. Worries about tomorrow begin arranging themselves into detailed scenarios. Old conversations replay without invitation, and questions that seemed unimportant during the noise of daily life suddenly demand attention. It is not silence that feels unsettling. It is what silence allows us to hear. For many people, constant activity has become so familiar that they mistake movement for peace. As long as something occupies the mind, there is little need to examine what lies beneath it. The schedule stays full, the notifications continue arriving, another video begins playing, another conversation fills the empty space, and the deeper parts of the mind patiently wait for a moment that rarely comes. The absence of noise is often mistaken for emptiness when, in reality, it is the first opportunity to notice everything that has been quietly asking for attention. Modern life makes this avoidance remarkably easy. There is always another message to answer, another headline to read, another task waiting to be completed, another form of entertainment available within seconds. None of these things are harmful on their own. Many of them enrich life when approached with balance. The difficulty begins when they quietly become tools for escaping ourselves rather than simply enjoying the world around us. A few moments of boredom immediately lead toward a screen. An uncomfortable emotion is interrupted before it can fully unfold. Waiting in line becomes another opportunity to scroll through endless information instead of simply standing still. Gradually, the mind loses its familiarity with silence because silence has become something to eliminate instead of experience. This constant stimulation creates the illusion of fullness while quietly preventing deeper understanding. Thoughts never remain in one place long enough to be explored. Emotions appear briefly before being replaced by fresh distractions. The inner world grows increasingly unfamiliar because attention is continually directed outward. Avoidance often feels productive because it keeps difficult emotions temporarily out of sight. A painful memory seems less noticeable while work demands complete attention. Loneliness appears quieter when surrounded by constant entertainment. Anxiety feels more distant while the mind remains occupied with endless activity. For a short time, these strategies seem effective. Unfortunately, whatever is avoided rarely disappears. It simply waits. Thoughts postponed today often return tomorrow with greater intensity. Feelings ignored for months quietly gather weight beneath awareness until they eventually demand recognition in ways that become impossible to overlook. The mind possesses remarkable patience. It does not forget what has been buried. It simply continues carrying it until the opportunity for honest attention finally arrives. This explains why many people feel unexpectedly overwhelmed during periods that should feel restful. The vacation begins, the weekend arrives, responsibilities become lighter, and suddenly emotions that seemed absent all week quietly rise to the surface. They were never truly gone. They were simply hidden beneath constant movement. Learning to remain with yourself in these quiet moments requires a different kind of courage than most people expect. It does not involve dramatic action or extraordinary achievement. It asks only for the willingness to stop running for a little while. At first, this can feel uncomfortable because the mind immediately notices how restless it has become. Thoughts move rapidly from one subject to another. Attention wanders without invitation. Old regrets appear beside future worries, creating the impression that stillness has somehow made life more complicated. In truth, nothing new has been created. The quiet has simply revealed what constant distraction had been covering. This realization is important because it changes the purpose of solitude. Instead of seeing it as something that creates discomfort, you begin recognizing it as something that exposes discomfort already waiting beneath the surface. The silence is not the source of the struggle, it is merely the light that allows it to be seen clearly. As this understanding deepens, solitude slowly begins changing its character. What once felt like isolation starts becoming an opportunity for acquaintance. You begin meeting parts of yourself that have long been ignored. Certain fears lose their mystery because they are finally observed instead of avoided. Old disappointments become easier to understand because they are no longer interrupted before they can fully unfold. Even difficult emotions begin softening once they are allowed to exist without immediate resistance. Much of their intensity came from the effort required to keep them hidden. The moment that effort relaxes, they often become far less overwhelming than the imagination had suggested. Patience quietly replaces urgency. Curiosity begins replacing fear. Instead of asking how to escape uncomfortable thoughts, attention gradually shifts toward understanding why they continue returning. That simple change opens a path that endless distraction could never reveal. This growing familiarity with your own inner life also changes the quality of your relationships with other people. Someone who has learned to sit peacefully with themselves no longer expects others to constantly fill every silence. Conversations become less hurried because listening grows more natural. Loneliness becomes different from solitude because the two experiences are no longer confused. Solitude becomes a chosen space for reflection rather than evidence of abandonment. The need for constant validation begins softening because you no longer feel like a stranger in your own company. There is a quiet strength in becoming someone whose presence is enough, even when no audience is watching and no external distraction is available. That strength cannot be purchased or borrowed. It develops gradually through repeated moments of remaining present with yourself, instead of immediately reaching for another escape. Over time, silence begins offering something that noise never could. It becomes a place where scattered thoughts slowly settle, much like muddy water becoming clear once it is left undisturbed. The answers you once chased through endless activity sometimes appear naturally after long periods of quiet observation. Decisions become less impulsive because they emerge from clarity rather than constant reaction. The mind grows steadier because it no longer fears its own company. Nothing extraordinary has changed on the outside. The world remains busy. Responsibilities continue. Distractions still exist wherever you look. The difference is that they no longer possess complete authority over your attention. You begin carrying a quiet place within yourself that remains available regardless of external circumstances. In that stillness, you gradually rediscover a voice that had been buried beneath years of constant noise, and the longer you listen, the more familiar it becomes, until solitude no longer feels like being alone at all, but like returning home after wandering for far longer than you ever realized. Within that growing familiarity with silence, another discovery quietly begins to unfold. Thoughts never truly stop arriving. One fades, another immediately takes its place. Some are ordinary and practical, reminding you of simple responsibilities waiting to be completed. Others carry memories from years ago with surprising clarity. Some predict futures that may never arrive, while others quietly criticize nearly everything you do. This endless movement often creates the impression that thinking itself must always be trusted. After all, the voice sounds like your own. It speaks with confidence. It rarely pauses to question itself. Because of this, many people spend years assuming that every thought deserves attention simply because it appeared inside their own mind. Few stop to consider that thoughts, like passing clouds, arrive constantly without asking permission. Their appearance alone does not determine their truth. The mind produces possibilities, interpretations, fears, hopes, judgments, and assumptions almost continuously. Some deserve careful reflection. Others deserve nothing more than quiet observation before they drift away on their own. This distinction is far more important than it first appears. Consider how often a single thought quietly changes the emotional direction of an entire day. One moment everything feels ordinary. Then an unexpected idea appears. Perhaps someone is disappointed with me. Perhaps I am falling behind. Perhaps this mistake proves I am incapable. Within seconds, the body begins responding as though these conclusions have already been confirmed. The heart becomes heavier, shoulders tighten, attention narrows around imagined evidence supporting the original thought. Soon another thought joins the first, strengthening it further. Before long, an entire emotional experience has been built upon an idea that may never have reflected reality in the first place. The remarkable part is how rarely this process announces itself. It unfolds so naturally that interpretation begins feeling identical to fact. The thought is accepted before it has even been examined. Fear understands this process exceptionally well. It rarely introduces itself by saying, "I am fear." Instead, it often speaks the language of caution, responsibility, and preparation. It quietly suggests that disaster is likely unless every possible outcome has been considered in advance. It encourages endless rehearsals of difficult conversations, repeated examinations of unlikely dangers, and constant anticipation of future disappointment. Many of these thoughts sound intelligent because they borrow the appearance of careful planning. Yet careful planning eventually reaches a point where action becomes necessary. Fear prefers remaining in preparation forever because endless preparation never risks failure. It promises safety while quietly preventing growth. Left unquestioned, it becomes easy to mistake hesitation for wisdom simply because both can appear thoughtful from the outside. Doubt follows a similar path. It rarely arrives dramatically. More often it whispers quietly during moments when commitment becomes necessary. You are probably not ready. Someone else could do this better. Wait a little longer, learn a little more, become slightly more prepared before taking the next step. At first, these suggestions sound reasonable. Sometimes they even contain a small amount of truth. There are moments when patience genuinely serves us well. The difficulty begins when doubt quietly becomes the permanent advisor behind every important decision. Nothing ever feels sufficient. Every achievement seems incomplete. Every opportunity appears slightly beyond reach. Instead of encouraging improvement, doubt slowly convinces the mind that readiness is always somewhere in the future. Life becomes a series of postponed beginnings because confidence is expected to arrive before experience rather than because of it. Learning to notice this process creates one of the most important changes a person can experience. Instead of immediately following every thought wherever it leads, you begin watching thoughts arrive before deciding whether they deserve your attention. This simple pause appears almost insignificant, yet it quietly transforms the entire relationship between awareness and impulse. A fearful prediction appears, but instead of accepting it automatically, you observe it. A critical judgment enters the mind, but instead of believing it immediately, you become curious about where it came from. The thought still exists. Nothing has been forced away. The difference is that awareness now stands beside it instead of becoming completely absorbed by it. Space begins appearing where there was once only reaction. This growing distance does not silence the mind. Thoughts continue arriving because that is part of being human. The goal has never been to stop thinking altogether. The goal is learning that awareness is larger than any single thought passing through it. Imagine standing beside a quiet river. Leaves drift across the surface, carried away by the current without asking your permission. You notice each one, yet you feel no obligation to reach into the water and hold on to every passing leaf. Thoughts behave much the same way. Some deserve careful attention because they contain wisdom or practical guidance. Others are simply passing impressions shaped by old habits, temporary emotions, or incomplete understanding. The more patiently you observe them, the easier it becomes to recognize the difference. This quiet practice gradually changes everyday life in ways that are almost invisible at first. Conversations become calmer because immediate reactions lose some of their urgency. Difficult situations become easier to navigate because the first emotional impulse is no longer treated as the final answer. Even moments of disappointment carry a different quality because interpretation is no longer automatic. The mind begins asking whether its first conclusion deserves trust before building an emotional world around it. As Epictetus advised, it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. That question alone creates remarkable freedom. Reactions that once seemed unavoidable become choices examined with patience instead of habits followed without awareness. Over time, the distance between thought and action grows naturally, and within that distance, something quietly powerful begins taking shape. Instead of being carried wherever the mind happens to wander, you slowly become the one who chooses which thoughts deserve belief, which deserve compassion, and which deserve nothing more than a gentle smile before allowing them to continue on their way. If thoughts can be observed without immediately being believed, then emotions deserve the same kind of patient attention. This idea feels unusual because emotions often appear so quickly that they seem impossible to separate from who we are. Anxiety arrives, and within moments it feels as though the entire world has become dangerous. Anger appears, and suddenly every conversation seems shaped by irritation. Sadness settles quietly over the day, making even simple tasks feel heavier than they did only hours before. Because emotions are deeply felt, they often convince us that they must also be obeyed. The experience feels so immediate that observation hardly seems possible, yet there is an important difference between experiencing an emotion and allowing that emotion to decide every thought, every word, and every action that follows. One belongs to being human, the other belongs to habit. Learning to recognize that distinction changes the relationship you have with yourself in ways that are both subtle and profound. Many people spend years believing emotions are instructions rather than experiences. Fear says retreat, so they retreat. Anger demands retaliation, so they react before reflection has the opportunity to speak. Anxiety predicts disaster, and they begin living as though the prediction has already become reality. This process happens so naturally that it often escapes notice. The emotion appears first, then the action follows almost automatically. Little space exists between the two. Over time, this repeated pattern creates the impression that emotions possess complete authority over behavior. Life begins feeling unpredictable because emotional weather changes constantly. A peaceful morning becomes a stressful afternoon because one unexpected event shifts the emotional landscape. A single conversation changes the direction of an entire day. The mind quietly accepts these changes as unavoidable, never realizing that another possibility has always existed beneath the surface. Anxiety offers one of the clearest examples. It often presents itself as preparation. The mind races through countless future possibilities, convinced that enough anticipation will somehow prevent disappointment. Every outcome is examined, every mistake is rehearsed before it occurs, every conversation is mentally rewritten in search of perfect control. This constant activity creates the impression of productivity, yet much of it simply repeats uncertainty without resolving it. Anxiety mistakes endless thinking for effective preparation. It convinces the mind that if worrying continues long enough, certainty will eventually appear. Unfortunately, certainty rarely arrives through worry alone. The body grows tired. The mind becomes overwhelmed. Tomorrow remains just as unpredictable as it was before the worrying began. The emotion carried useful information by revealing concern, but it quietly exceeded its purpose once it began demanding endless attention. Anger follows a similar pattern, although it speaks with greater force. It promises immediate relief through reaction. A sharp reply feels justified. Holding resentment appears necessary. The mind begins collecting reasons to remain upset because anger prefers evidence that confirms its presence. During these moments, patience feels almost unnatural. Reflection seems unnecessary because the emotion insists the situation has already been understood completely. Yet time often reveals details that intense emotion could not see. Misunderstandings become clearer. Intentions appear more complicated than first assumed. Circumstances once interpreted as personal attacks sometimes reveal entirely different explanations. This does not mean anger is always misplaced. There are genuine injustices that deserve firm responses. The lesson is simply that strong emotion does not always produce the clearest vision. Acting immediately under its influence often creates consequences that calm reflection would have prevented. Sadness teaches a quieter lesson. Unlike anger or anxiety, it rarely demands urgent action. Instead, it slows everything down. Ordinary responsibilities feel heavier. Motivation fades. Energy becomes difficult to find. Many people immediately resist this experience because they believe every difficult emotion must disappear as quickly as possible. They criticize themselves for feeling low, adding frustration to the sadness already present. In doing so, they unknowingly create a second layer of suffering. The original emotion may have been natural. The judgment placed upon it becomes optional. Allowing sadness to exist without immediately condemning it often softens its intensity. It becomes something experienced with compassion rather than something fought with endless self-criticism. This quiet acceptance creates room for healing that constant resistance rarely allows. As this understanding deepens, emotions begin occupying a different place within the mind. They are welcomed as visitors instead of crowned as rulers. They arrive carrying messages, but they no longer dictate every response. Anxiety may still appear before an important decision, yet it no longer determines whether the decision will be made. Anger may still arise after unfair treatment, but it no longer decides every word that follows. Sadness may remain present after loss, yet it no longer convinces you that hope has disappeared forever. This does not make emotions weaker, it simply places them in proper relationship with awareness. They become part of your experience without becoming the entirety of your identity. Life slowly begins feeling different when this quiet discipline becomes familiar. Emotional storms still arrive because no one is exempt from being human. The difference lies in how they are met. Instead of reacting immediately, you begin listening carefully. Instead of becoming overwhelmed by every feeling, you grow curious about what it is trying to reveal. Some emotions point toward problems that deserve attention. Others simply reflect temporary conditions that will pass if given enough space. The ability to recognize the difference becomes one of the greatest sources of inner steadiness. Over time, the mind no longer experiences life as a series of emotional emergencies demanding immediate action. It begins experiencing emotions as changing weather, moving across a much larger sky, knowing that while the clouds may temporarily darken the horizon, they never possess the power to replace the sky itself. This quieter relationship with emotion gradually transforms another part of life that once seemed almost impossible to change. The way you begin seeing other people slowly shifts as well. For a long time, it may have felt as though your peace depended upon their behavior. A careless comment could linger in your thoughts for days. Someone's cold attitude could quietly influence your mood from morning until night. A disagreement might continue long after the conversation ended because the mind kept returning to it, searching for different words, different outcomes, or some explanation that would finally make everything feel settled. Without realizing it, your emotional world became closely connected to choices that belonged entirely to someone else. Their reactions shaped your own. Their approval created comfort. Their criticism created discomfort. Their decisions quietly determined the condition of your inner life. This arrangement rarely felt intentional. It simply became the natural way of responding to people. The more deeply you begin understanding your own thoughts and emotions, however, the more clearly you recognize that another person's behavior does not automatically deserve that level of influence. This realization does not happen because people suddenly become easier to deal with. Difficult personalities continue existing. Misunderstandings still arise. Some individuals remain impatient, dishonest, selfish, or unkind, despite your best efforts to treat them fairly. The difference appears within your own response. Instead of assuming every unpleasant interaction must become a personal burden, you begin recognizing that every human being is carrying an inner world you cannot fully see. The impatient stranger may be fighting fears they have never spoken aloud. The harsh coworker may be carrying disappointments that began years before you met them. The family member who constantly criticizes others may be living under impossible expectations they quietly place upon themselves every day. None of this changes the reality of their actions. Hurtful words remain hurtful. Unfair treatment remains unfair. Yet understanding that people are often acting from struggles invisible to everyone else creates a small but meaningful distance between their behavior and your reaction to it. Most harmful behavior begins long before the moment it reaches another person. It grows from unexamined fears, unresolved pain, unhealthy habits, mistaken beliefs, or years of emotional confusion that slowly shape the way someone sees the world. A person who constantly seeks control is often deeply afraid of uncertainty. Someone who quickly becomes angry may have spent years believing anger was the only acceptable way to express pain. Another who constantly judges others may be living under relentless self-judgment without even realizing it. These patterns rarely excuse harmful choices, but they often explain why they continue repeating themselves. Once this becomes visible, resentment begins losing some of its strength because you stop assuming every hurtful action was carefully designed to wound you personally. Sometimes people are simply acting according to burdens they have never learned to carry wisely. This understanding also changes the way conflict is experienced. Before, disagreements may have felt like battles that had to end with someone being proven right. Winning the argument seemed necessary because losing appeared to threaten your identity. Now another possibility quietly appears. The purpose of every disagreement is not always victory. Sometimes the wiser choice is simply refusing to allow another person's emotional state to become your own. When someone speaks with anger, you no longer feel compelled to answer with equal intensity. When someone misunderstands your intentions, the immediate urge to defend yourself begins softening. You realize that not every misunderstanding can be resolved, and not every opinion needs to be changed. Some people are simply viewing life through experiences so different from yours that agreement may never fully arrive. Accepting this truth often protects far more peace than endless attempts to convince everyone to see the world exactly as you do. There is also a quieter form of compassion that develops toward yourself. Once you begin recognizing that other people act from imperfect understanding, it becomes harder to demand perfection from your own past decisions. You remember times when fear influenced your choices, when frustration shaped your words, or when exhaustion prevented you from becoming the person you hoped to be. Instead of carrying endless shame, you begin seeing those moments with greater honesty. You acknowledge responsibility without becoming imprisoned by self-condemnation. This does not weaken accountability. It strengthens it because learning becomes possible where constant judgment once stood. The same patience you gradually extend toward others begins finding its way inward, allowing growth to replace endless self-punishment. Compassion should never be confused with passivity. Understanding another person's pain does not require accepting repeated disrespect. Recognizing someone's struggles does not mean abandoning healthy boundaries. Wisdom knows the difference between empathy and surrender. There are relationships that deserve patience, and there are situations where distance becomes the healthiest expression of respect for yourself. Compassion simply changes the spirit in which those decisions are made. You step away without hatred. You protect your peace without wishing harm upon anyone else. You allow consequences to exist without carrying unnecessary bitterness alongside them. This balance often requires more strength than either constant forgiveness or constant retaliation, because it asks you to remain steady even when emotions encourage more extreme responses. As this perspective grows stronger, you begin noticing that many interactions no longer follow familiar patterns. Someone behaves rudely, and instead of immediately absorbing their mood, you quietly recognize that their behavior belongs to them. Someone disagrees with your choices, and instead of questioning your entire identity, you calmly consider whether their opinion contains anything useful before allowing the rest to pass. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been. Conversations become lighter because they are no longer carrying the invisible weight of constant emotional defense. Relationships become healthier because they are built upon understanding rather than endless attempts to control one another. Even silence changes. It stops feeling uncomfortable because you no longer believe every pause must be filled with explanation or approval. Gradually, another quiet freedom begins taking root. Other people continue living according to their own judgments, fears, hopes, and limitations, just as they always have. Some will appreciate your presence. Others may misunderstand it completely. Both outcomes become easier to accept because your inner world no longer rises and falls with every changing opinion. Compassion becomes less like a difficult practice and more like a natural consequence of seeing people clearly. You recognize that everyone is carrying burdens invisible to those around them, including burdens they may not fully understand themselves. This awareness does not remove responsibility, nor does it erase the need for wisdom and healthy boundaries. It simply prevents another person's pain from becoming a burden you continue carrying long after they have already walked away, allowing your own peace to remain where it has always belonged, quietly rooted within rather than scattered among the changing actions of others. As resentment slowly begins losing its grip, forgiveness starts revealing a meaning that is far different from the one many people first imagine. For years, it may have seemed like something offered only to those who caused pain, almost as though releasing anger meant rewarding harmful behavior or pretending that difficult experiences never happened. That misunderstanding often keeps people holding tightly to old wounds because resentment appears to protect them from being hurt again. It creates the impression that remaining angry is a form of strength, a promise never to become vulnerable in the same way twice. At first, this feels convincing. The mind believes that holding on to pain keeps important lessons alive. Yet with enough time, another truth quietly becomes impossible to ignore. The person carrying resentment often suffers far longer than the person who created it. Long after the words were spoken or the event has passed, the memory continues demanding emotional energy. The past keeps asking for attention while the present patiently waits in the background, unable to receive the focus it deserves. Old injuries possess a quiet ability to reshape the way new experiences are interpreted. A broken promise makes trust feel dangerous, even in relationships where no betrayal has occurred. One painful disappointment encourages suspicion toward opportunities that have not yet had the chance to unfold. The mind, hoping to prevent future suffering, begins expecting familiar pain before it arrives. It searches constantly for signs that history is preparing to repeat itself. This habit rarely develops because a person enjoys negativity. It grows from an understandable desire for protection. Unfortunately, protection built entirely upon fear often creates another form of imprisonment. Instead of allowing the past to remain a completed chapter, it quietly becomes the author of every new one. Fresh experiences are judged through old memories. New people inherit expectations shaped by someone else's choices. Tomorrow begins carrying burdens that belong entirely to yesterday. Resentment strengthens this pattern because it continually asks the mind to revisit moments that cannot be changed. It quietly says, "Remember what happened. Do not forget how you felt. Stay alert because it could happen again." These thoughts appear protective, yet they often prevent genuine healing from taking place. Each return to the memory strengthens emotional pathways that might otherwise have softened with time. The event gradually becomes more familiar than the present moment because it has been rehearsed so often. Without realizing it, a person begins living in conversation with experiences that no longer exist outside memory. Days continue passing. New opportunities quietly appear. Meaningful relationships attempt to grow. Still, part of the mind remains occupied guarding an old wound that no longer requires constant attention but has become difficult to release simply because carrying it has become familiar. Forgiveness begins with recognizing that continuing this inner struggle no longer serves the life you are trying to build. This realization does not happen because the past suddenly becomes acceptable. Certain actions remain deeply wrong. Certain losses cannot be undone. Some words leave lasting marks that deserve to be acknowledged honestly rather than ignored. Forgiveness does not ask you to rewrite history or pretend injustice never occurred. It asks something much quieter. It asks whether allowing yesterday's pain to occupy today's thoughts is creating wisdom or simply extending suffering. The answer is rarely immediate because the mind often confuses remembering with healing. It believes letting go means forgetting important lessons. In reality, lessons can remain while unnecessary suffering gradually fades. Memory and resentment are not the same thing. One preserves understanding, the other repeatedly recreates emotional conflict long after its purpose has ended. This distinction changes everything. A person who forgives does not lose awareness. They simply stop allowing old experiences to determine every future response. Caution may still remain where caution is appropriate. Boundaries may become stronger than before. Trust may be offered more thoughtfully rather than carelessly. None of these choices require ongoing bitterness. In fact, they often become clearer once resentment begins dissolving because decisions are no longer driven entirely by emotional reaction. They grow instead from calm understanding. You recognize what happened without becoming trapped inside it. The past remains part of your story, but it no longer dictates the direction of every chapter that follows. This quiet freedom cannot be forced. It develops gradually, one moment of release at a time, until carrying anger begins feeling heavier than setting it down. The same process eventually reaches inward as well. Many people find it easier to forgive others than themselves. Old mistakes continue echoing through years of quiet self-judgment. Decisions made during seasons of fear, confusion, or immaturity become permanent evidence against personal worth. Even after growth has clearly taken place, the mind keeps returning to earlier failures, as though repeating them often enough might somehow rewrite the outcome. Yet, self-condemnation rarely creates wisdom. More often, it quietly steals the confidence required for future growth. Looking honestly at past mistakes remains necessary because responsibility matters. Growth depends upon recognizing where change is needed. Endless punishment, however, serves little purpose once the lesson has already been learned. Carrying guilt forever does not honor the past. It merely prevents the future from unfolding with the clarity it deserves. As forgiveness deepens, another unexpected change begins taking place. The emotional space once occupied by resentment slowly becomes available for something else. Gratitude appears more naturally because attention is no longer consumed by old conflicts. Patience grows because the mind has stopped fighting battles that ended long ago. Compassion becomes easier because personal suffering has revealed how heavy invisible burdens can become when carried without relief. Even joy feels different. It no longer arrives with the constant fear that the past might suddenly reclaim it. Instead, it quietly settles into ordinary moments that once passed unnoticed while emotional energy remained tied to old wounds. Life itself begins feeling lighter, not because difficulties have disappeared, but because fewer unnecessary burdens are being carried through them. Over time, forgiveness reveals itself as one of the greatest acts of freedom a person can offer themselves. It is not a reward given to those who caused pain, nor is it a denial of what truly happened. It is the quiet decision to stop allowing yesterday's injuries to quietly govern tomorrow's possibilities. The past keeps its place in memory without taking permanent residence in the present. The lessons remain, the wisdom remains, even the scars may remain. What gradually disappears is the endless inner struggle demanding that life become something other than what it has already been. In releasing that struggle, room is created for peace, growth, and quiet strength to take root where resentment once lived, allowing the future to be shaped not by old wounds, but by the person you continue choosing to become each passing day. As these reflections come to an end, remember that nothing truly changes because of a single idea. Real transformation begins with the quiet choices you make after the words have faded. Each moment offers another opportunity to respond with greater wisdom, greater patience, and greater peace than before. That is how an ordinary life slowly becomes an extraordinary one, not through perfect circumstances, but through a steady mind that refuses to be ruled by them. Thank you for spending this time with Stoic Journal. Your presence here means more than you know. If this journey resonated with you, continue it by watching one of the videos now appearing on your screen. Until next time, take care of your mind, protect your peace, and continue becoming the person no circumstance can overcome.